She never imagined that her life would change in a single moment, 1 second. She was standing at the altar, heart pounding, hands gripping the bouquet tightly the next. She was alone, staring at an empty space where he was supposed to be. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, turning into murmurs of shock, pity, and judgment. The officiant shifted uncomfortably. The silence stretched on, unbearable. She wanted to believe there was a mistake, that he would come rushing in, breathless, with an explanation. But deep down she knew. He wasn't coming back. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. The carefully planned wedding, the flowers, the music, the dress she had spent months choosing, all of it, felt meaningless now. Faces blurred together, some filled with sympathy, others with quiet satisfaction. Not everyone had believed in them. Not everyone had thought she was enough. And now, they had proof. The humiliation burned, but underneath it was something else. A flicker of something she hadn't expected. Anger. Not just at him, but at herself. At the way she had given up everything to make this relationship work. At the way she had shrunk herself to fit into his world, into his expectations. She felt the weight of every sacrifice she had made. The job opportunities she had turned down because they didn't align with his plans. The dreams she had pushed aside to support his. The way she had silenced her own voice, convinced that love meant compromise until she was the only one compromising. The world expected her to fall apart, to collapse in tears, to run away in shame. But as she stood there, something shifted inside her. She wasn't going to be the woman they pitied. She wasn't going to let this define her. If he didn't see her worth, then she would make sure the whole world did. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and did something no one expected. She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and walked out, not as a woman abandoned, but as someone about to take control of her own story. And that was the moment everything changed. She walked out of that wedding hall with her head held high, but the moment she stepped outside, the weight of everything hit her. The cool air stung her skin, and the sounds of the city felt louder than ever. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of her dress, the fabric that once felt like a dream, now clinging to her like a cruel reminder. She had no plan, no idea what came next. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. Not in this place. Not in this version of herself. People would talk. They would dissect every moment of what had happened, turn her pain into gossip, and whisper about how she had been left behind. She could already imagine the pitying looks, the forced kindness, the subtle judgment. She had spent her whole life trying to meet expectations, trying to be what others wanted her to be. And where had it gotten her? She needed to disappear, even if just for a while. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone, booked the first flight out of the city, and left with nothing but the dress on her back and a small carry-on she had packed for the honeymoon that would never happen. The plane ride was a blur. She barely noticed the flight attendants, the hum of the engines, the people around her, who had no idea that just hours ago she had been left standing alone in front of 100 people. But as the city lights faded beneath her, something inside her shifted. Maybe this was exactly what she needed, a blank slate, a place where no one knew her name or her story. When she landed, she didn't hesitate. She stepped off the plane, hailed a cab, and found herself in a city that pulsed with life. It was nothing like home, louder, faster, filled with people chasing their own dreams. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to freedom. She checked into a small hotel, ignoring the way the receptionist glanced at her wedding dress with quiet curiosity. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. She didn't even owe herself one, at least not yet. For the next few days, she let herself breathe. She wandered through the streets, sat in cafes watching people rush by, and tried to figure out what came next. The pain was still there, sitting heavy in her chest, but she refused to let it consume her. Then one evening, as she sipped a coffee by the window of a small bookstore, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. A group of people at the next table were talking about an upcoming event, a gathering of entrepreneurs, innovators, and creatives. They spoke with excitement, their voices filled with passion. She didn't know what made her do it, but before she could second-guess herself, she turned to them and asked, "How do you get in?" They looked at her, surprised, but one of them smiled and slid a flyer across the table. "You just have to show up," they said. And so, she did. The event was unlike anything she had ever experienced. People from all over the world had come together, sharing ideas, building businesses, creating change. She listened, observed, and for the first time in a long time, she saw possibilities instead of limitations. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into someone else's world. But what if she built her own? She started small. She attended more events, introduced herself to people who were shaping industries, and soaked up everything she could. She had no roadmap, no formal experience, but she had resilience. She had something to prove, not to the man who left her, not to the people who doubted her, but to herself. Late nights turned into early mornings. She read, researched, and started crafting an idea that had been buried inside her for years. She remembered the dreams she had set aside, the ones she thought weren't possible, because they didn't fit into the life she had planned. But that life was gone now, and in its place was something new. She wasn't running away anymore. She was building something. And soon, the world would take notice. She barely recognized herself anymore, and maybe that was a good thing. The woman who had been abandoned at the altar felt like a distant memory, a version of herself that had belonged to a different life. Now, she was immersed in something bigger, an idea that had taken root in her mind and refused to let go. She spent her days attending conferences, networking with people who had built empires from nothing, and absorbing every piece of knowledge she could. The nights were spent in a tiny rented apartment surrounded by notebooks filled with scribbled plans, late-night research, and the kind of determination that kept her awake long after the city had gone quiet. She didn't have a clear roadmap, but she had something better, an unshakable belief that she could turn her pain into something powerful. But success didn't come easily. Doors didn't swing open just because she had a vision. Investors didn't take her seriously at first. She could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken questions. Was she experienced enough? Did she have the skills? Was she just another dreamer who would give up when things got hard? The rejection stung, but it didn't break her. If anything, it fueled her. Every time someone told her no, she refined her approach. Every time she faced a setback, she learned from it. She started reaching out to people who had once been in her position, people who had built something from the ground up. Some ignored her. Others gave her a few minutes of their time, just enough to offer advice before moving on. And then, there were those who saw something in her, the same hunger they had once felt. One connection led to another, and before she knew it, she had found her first mentor, a woman who had built a business from nothing, who had faced every possible challenge, and still come out on top. She didn't sugarcoat things. She told her the truth: success wasn't just about having a good idea. It was about grit, perseverance, learning to take the punches and keep moving forward. At the same time, she was still fighting her own doubts. Late at night, when exhaustion weighed on her, she wondered if she was really strong enough to do this. She had always been the kind of person who followed the rules, who played it safe. This was new territory, and there were moments when she felt completely lost. And then, there was the past she couldn't fully escape. Word had traveled back to her hometown. The people who once pitied her were now watching her journey unfold, some with admiration, others with disbelief. Even he had heard. The man who had left her standing alone that day. She never expected to hear from him again, but one evening, she received a message she hadn't been prepared for. It was short, simple. A question. Is this really you? She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to pretend he no longer existed. But another part of her, the part that had spent too many nights wondering why she hadn't been enough for him, needed to face it. She took a deep breath and typed back 2 words. "Yes, it is." The response came almost instantly. "We should talk." And just like that, the past she had worked so hard to leave behind threatened to pull her back in. But she wasn't the same woman anymore. And this time, she would be the one in control. She read the message over and over again, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Curiosity, frustration, maybe even a hint of something she didn't want to admit. After everything, after all the pain, why now? What did he want? She didn't reply right away. Instead, she focused on the empire she was building, throwing herself even deeper into her work. The business was growing faster than she could have imagined. The same people who once doubted her were now taking her seriously. She was being invited to speak at events, her face appearing in articles about self-made success stories. But with that success came pressure, more responsibilities, more expectations, and now a ghost from her past trying to pull her attention away. Days passed, and he messaged again. "I just want to talk. Please." Something about that word, please, made her pause. He had never been the type to ask for anything twice. He had always been so sure of himself, so confident. But now there was something different in his tone. She told herself she didn't care, but she knew she would have to face him eventually. If only to prove to herself that he no longer had power over her. She agreed to meet. Not in some quiet, hidden place where old wounds could reopen, but in a busy public setting where she held all the control. When she arrived, she almost didn't recognize him. He looked different. Older. Less certain. He stood when he saw her, his eyes filled with something unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally he said, "You look different." She smiled, but it wasn't the same smile he had once known. "I am different." They sat, and the conversation began awkwardly. Small talk. How had she been? How was life treating her? She answered in vague terms, unwilling to give him the satisfaction, knowing how hard she had worked to erase him from her life. But then he shifted in his seat, exhaling sharply, before saying what she knew had been on his mind from the start. "I made a mistake." She didn't flinch, but something inside her tensed. She had imagined this moment before, played out how it would go, but hearing the words out loud felt different. She leaned back, tilting her head slightly. "Which part? Walking away? Or thinking I wouldn't survive without you?" His jaw tightened. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "For you," she corrected. "Not for me." He looked down, exhaling slowly before meeting her gaze again. "I see that now. And I see you now." The words hung between them, heavy and full of meaning. But she refused to let herself be pulled in. She wasn't here for closure. She had already found it within herself long ago. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. A message from her team. A deal she had been working on for months had just gone through. It was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would push her business into a new league entirely. She looked up at him one last time, then stood. "I have to go. I have an empire to run." And with that, she walked away, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. She walked away without looking back, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she stepped out into the city that now belonged to her. The past had no power over her anymore. At least, that's what she told herself. But just as she reached her car, her phone buzzed again. Another message. Not from him, this time. This one was from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust. Not everyone wants to see you win." Her fingers tightened around the phone. For a moment, she stood still, staring at the screen, feeling a strange, creeping unease settle over her. She had dealt with competition before, with doubters, with people trying to bring her down. But this felt different. Personal. Shaking it off, She got into the car, reminding herself that she had too much to lose to let paranoia take over. The deal she had just closed was going to change everything. Her brand was expanding internationally, her influence growing faster than anyone had expected. She had fought for this, bled for this. Nothing could take it away now. But as the days passed, the messages didn't stop. Some were vague, like the first. Others were more pointed. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. Not everyone is happy about your success. You should have stayed in your lane. She didn't tell anyone at first. She wasn't the type to show fear. But when one of her business meetings was suddenly cancelled without warning, followed by a high-profile investor pulling out without explanation, she knew this wasn't just idle threats. Someone was working against her. She started digging, reaching out to contacts, tracing connections, looking for patterns. And then one night, a name appeared on her screen that made her stomach drop. A name she never thought she'd have to see again. The same name attached to the biggest deal of her career. He was involved. Somehow, someway, he had found his way back into her world, not as a man begging for her forgiveness, but as an obstacle standing in her way. Had the meeting been a setup? Had he been testing her, waiting to see if she still cared? Or was this his way of punishing her for moving on, for proving that she never needed him to begin with? She didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over, and if he thought he could take away everything she had built, he was about to learn the hard way she wasn't the same woman he left behind. She sat in her office, staring at the city lights flickering beyond the glass wall. The weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on her shoulders. Every move she made, every deal she secured, it all seemed to unravel as quickly as she built it. Someone was pulling the strings, and she knew exactly who it was. He'd been watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The messages, the cancelled meetings, the sudden shifts in the market, none of it was random. He wasn't just trying to hurt her business, he was trying to destroy everything she had worked for. But why? Was it revenge? Or was there something deeper, something she hadn't seen coming? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She turned to see one of her most trusted advisors, a man who had stood by her since the beginning. His face was tense, his expression unreadable. He stepped inside and placed a file on her desk. "You need to see this." She hesitated before opening it. Inside were documents, financial records, and a timeline that connected every attack against her company to a single source. But what caught her attention wasn't just his name, it was another name alongside it. Someone she had trusted. Someone who had been by her side through it all. Her breath caught. This can't be right. He nodded grimly. It is. Betrayal hit her harder than any business loss ever could. It wasn't just him, it was someone from her own inner circle. Someone who had smiled in her face while working against her behind the scenes. It all made sense now. Every time she had taken a step forward, they had found a way to drag her back. And she had never seen it coming. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she pieced it together. The attacks weren't just about her business. They were about power. Control. He hadn't returned for revenge. He had returned because he thought he could take back what he lost. And he had found someone willing to help him do it. She closed the file and stood, her mind racing. If they thought she was going to let them win, they had underestimated her one last time. The meeting was set. A private gathering, just the three of them. No board members, no lawyers, just the truth, laid bare. She arrived first, her expression calm, unreadable. When they entered, she could see the confidence in his eyes, the smug certainty that he still had the upper hand. And then there was the other one, the one who had pretended to be loyal. She placed the file on the table and slid it across. "I know everything." Silence filled the room. For the first time, she saw hesitation flicker across his face. The other one shifted uncomfortably, their betrayal evident. "You thought you could break me," she said, her voice steady. "You thought I would fold just like before. But you forgot one thing, I'm not the same woman you left behind." He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And what are you going to do about it?" She leaned forward, her tone sharp. "I already did it." The doors opened, and security stepped in. Legal teams were waiting outside. Every move they had made, every deal they had sabotaged, every lie they had told, it had all been traced back to them. Their game was over. As they were led out, he turned back one last time. "This isn't the end." She met his gaze without flinching. "For you, it is." The moment the doors closed behind them, she exhaled. The war was over, but the scars would remain. Yet as she looked out at the city, the empire she had built with her own hands, she knew one thing for sure. She had won. And this time, no one could take it from her. She stood by the window, watching the city she had once feared slipping away from her grasp. But not anymore. It was hers now, fully, completely. The shadows that had threatened to consume her had been dragged into the light, exposed for what they truly were. Yet despite the victory, an emptiness lingered. Winning wasn't always about celebration. Sometimes it was about surviving. Her phone buzzed. A message from her legal team confirmed what she already knew: his assets were frozen. The lawsuits had been filed, and the world was finally seeing the truth. There was no way back for him now. The empire he thought he could steal had been fortified against him, and his name was already turning into a cautionary tale. But there was still the other one, the one who had stood beside her all these years, only to betray her at the last moment. That wound would take longer to heal. She stepped out of her office and walked through the hallways of the company she had built. Employees nodded as she passed, a silent show of respect, of relief. They had seen the struggle. They had watched her fight battles they didn't even know existed. And now, they stood in a place that was stronger because of it. In the days that followed, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines captured the scandal, interviews dissected. Every detail and social media erupted with support. But she didn't engage. She had said everything she needed to say in that boardroom. Now, it was time to move forward. There were calls from investors, from business partners, even from people who had once doubted her. Suddenly, they saw her not just as a leader, but as an unstoppable force. But she didn't need their validation. She never had. The only difference now was that the world finally understood what she had always known: she was never just enough. She was more. One evening, as she sat on her balcony overlooking the city, an old friend visited. Someone who had stood by her when things were uncertain, when she wasn't sure if she could fight another day. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. But before leaving, they said something that stayed with her. You didn't just win. You rewrote the rules. And that was it, wasn't it? She had spent years fighting for a seat at the table, only to realize that she had the power to build her own. And she had. Months passed, and the world moved on, but she remained. Stronger. Wiser. The scars of betrayal would fade, but the lessons would stay. And as she prepared for the next chapter of her life, one thing was clear: she wasn't just leading an empire. She was setting the standard for what was possible. The past no longer had power over her. The future was hers to create. And this time, she would do it entirely on her own terms.